Hello, Africa. I am Ignatius Anom, and thank you for joining the interview. Angry African Americans saying enough is enough. The death of a black man in the United States late May has infuriated many the world over.
Wrong is wrong. Right is right. That's clearly wrong.
George Floyd died just minutes after a white police officer kept his knee around his neck for alleged forgery. Private autopsy reports indicate that the 46-year-old died of cardiac arrest over lack of oxygen. An earlier report claimed that Floyd's death had nothing to do with Officer Derek Chauvin's actions. The incident has sparked protests across several states and parts of Europe. Africa has joined the solidarity movement as Donald Trump vows to use military force to end the unrest. Injustices happen on the continent every day, but this has moved millions. A similar occurrence in South Africa during the COVID-19 lockdown also infuriated locals. On the interview, we speak to a Nairobi-based professor on how to tackle racial and economic inequalities for a just world. But first, what do Africans feel about treatment meted out to black people?
No person should be treated less than the other if they're living in a country where they're a citizen or even if they're an immigrant. And I think this should come to an end. And if anything, this is the time for these world leaders, global powers, to come together and say they should change the system. Unless, of course, it's institutionalized by themselves. So them not taking action is actually giving us a strong statement to say they're endorsing this.
What we need to take away from this moment as black people is the fact that there's no amount of peaceful negotiations, peaceful marches, diplomacy and discussions that will ever bring an end to racism. Racism has been violent against us for centuries, and there isn't a single group of oppressed people in the world that ever gained their freedom through peaceful negotiations. And this should teach us that we should always speak out against racism. We should always expose it because it has consistently for centuries led to our death.
PLO Lumumba is a professor of law and joins us via Nairobi in Kenya via Skype. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us, Professor Lumumba.
Thank you very much for inviting me to share my thoughts with you this morning.
Now, actor George Clooney has declared racism in the U.S. as, quote, a pandemic that infects us all. We need policymakers and politicians that reflect basic fairness to all their citizens equally. We have yet to find a vaccine in 400 years. And of quote, the HuffPost reports, is this a fair representation of what African Americans have endured in the States and elsewhere?
That indeed is a perfect representation. And George Floyd's death is yet just another unfortunate event in a chain of events that has occurred over the 400 years that African Americans have been enslaved in the continent of America and across the world. You will remember the very basis of the 1963 civil rights movement led by people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy was to ensure that there would be equality amongst all races. And when Martin himself was assassinated, people asked, we should not ask who killed Martin, but what killed Martin. And what killed Martin was systematic racism that has been injected in the American system. And if we are to conquer the ogre of racism, it is critical that laws must be reformed. It is critical that the miseducated white population must be re-educated. It is only in that way that we can conquer and immunize ourselves against racism.
Now, what would you say to some Africans who hold the view that African Americans should deal with their own issues because they fail to stand up for black issues everywhere? That seems to be the position of some Africans that I have spoken to.
That view, if it exists, is completely misguided and is not informed by history. Those who are aware of history will know that during the struggle by African countries to regain their independence, African Americans were very much in the forefront. People like W.B. Du Bois, People like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young, Jesse Jackson, and many Africans have been in the forefront agitating for Africans to be treated as human beings. So it is not true that they have been absent in the struggles for Mother Africa's freedom. They have always been there. You remember in the Manchester meeting in 1945, when they agitated for the freedom of the then colonized African countries, blacks from the Caribbean, from the United States of America, from Europe and different parts of the world gathered there to remind the world that their kith and kin in the continent were under colonial tutelage. So we need some history in order to inform ourselves of the reality.
Now, Professor Lumumba, activists are using the current moment to draw attention to their pain and have others listen to their plight. So how much more can black people take? Take a listen.
How much can a black person take? It seems like we always get the end of the stick when it comes down to fighting for what we want. I show you we had to fight for everything. We fought for 400 years. We fought for the right to vote. We fought, I mean, everything was fought. When is a time when they say, hey, we don't have to fight?
The notion that Africans or African Americans or black people everywhere have to fight for things. Professor Lumumba, there have been a record number of white people joining the protest against police brutality on African Americans and indeed Africans everywhere. Is there hope for the fight for racial equality and ultimately economic equality?
It is not going to be easy, but I am reminded as I answer this question of the immortal words of South Africa's Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, who, when confronted by white racism, said, there is only one race in the world, the human race. And I believe that if we adopt that attitude, then we can work towards racial equality. And it gladdens my heart that there are whites who now recognize that their own safety not only requires but demands that they are in solidarity with their black kith and kin, because that is the only way in which the world can be a peaceful place. So I was very happy when I watched the demonstration, not only in the United States of America, but across Europe, whites coming out in their droves and saying that we cannot tolerate what has been happening to our white brothers. In the United Kingdom, we saw only yesterday the statue of a white enslaver, which was erected in Bristol, was pulled down and thrown into the ocean. These are very important landmarks which ought to be celebrated.
Now, we've heard from the Ghanaian president. Immediately, this issue became something that captivated the world. What would you say the role of the African Union should be in tackling issues of police brutality, racial, and ultimately economic inequality, not only on African Americans, but within the continent?
Yeah, we know, of course, that the African continent has had its fair share of monster leaders like Mobutu Sese Seko, Jean-Bedel Bokassa, Hissène Habré, and Mengistu Haile Mariam, and there are many others who have visited pain upon the people of the continent. And therefore, in as much as we shout about the lives of people who have been killed in the United States of America by white police officers, we should also educate ourselves that our own police officers and our own security forces should not visit pain upon ourselves. And it is critical that we re-examine how we train our police officers. Many African countries still continue to train their police officers in the same way that the colonialists trained them, with the consequence that they see the people as their enemy. Yet they ought to be the protectors of the people. And I have been disappointed myself that whenever we visit pain upon one another, we don't think it is a great deal. Not so long ago, we saw the xenophobic attacks that took place in South Africa, and I didn't think that Africa came out with the zeal and zest that was necessary to remind our South African brethren that we are one and that we should work together. So going forward, we should point at the others, but we should also point at ourselves and liberate ourselves from the chains of pain that allow us to visit pain upon ourselves.
Finally, any word of advice for non-black people on what they can do to end racial and economic inequality?
You know, if racism is going to end, it is the whites, it is the Chinese, it is the Arabs that we sometimes don't talk about, but we should. It is the Asians, Indians that we should talk about. It is the Lebanese that we should talk about and remind them that this continent of Africa has given a lot to them and will continue to do so. But that going forward, they must respect the continent and respect our people. It is only then that we will have sustainable peace. But if they continue to treat Africans as hewers of wood and drawers of water, Africans are going to resist it, and peace will not be there for anybody.
Professor PLO Lumumba, thank you for your time. PLO Lumumba is a professor of law and an advocate for the high courts in Kenya and Tanganyika. Thank you for watching. I am Ignatius Ano, and goodbye.